Authors Over 50, Writing in Life's Sweetest Third. Authors Over 50's weekly podcast celebrates writers and their journeys to publication. Writing after 50 is a whole story on its own, so let's skip to life's sweetest third and talk with authors about their journey from pen to publish. Welcome. I'm Julia Daly, your host, and I invite you to listen to interviews with writers who've achieved their goal of publishing a book just later in life. We've seen award lists for under 30 or under 40, but I've yet to see lists for those who've achieved a significant milestone of their own, launching a new career and publishing their first book after the age of 50. We will hear about these authors' inspirations, struggles, strategies, and the smell of that first book. These writers' journeys inspire me because I'm one of them. My guest today is a career educator who studied history and French at Gonzaga University and has an MA in linguistics from the University of Washington. Her essays, poetry, and short fiction have appeared in various literary journals and anthologies. Her debut historical novel, The Ways of Water, was published in 2023. She lives with her husband on Washington State's Olympic Peninsula, where she tends a small orchard and writes about family, the power of place, and social and spiritual issues. Welcome to Authors Over 50, Teresa H. Janssen.
Thank you. It's a delight to be here, Julia.
Teresa, our opening question on Authors Over 50 is always, what took you so long to write your first book?
Oh, that's a great question. I would say I did the research for my book decades before I ever wrote. This novel is inspired by the life of my grandmother, Josie Bell Gore. I knew her and loved her. And I studied history at university, and I think it opened my eyes to the history that lie in my own family. So when I was a girl, and particularly in my 20s, I would often visit her, and I would ask her to tell me stories about her childhood. And I took notes, never intending to make it into a piece of literature. But I kept those notes, and by the time she had passed, I had quite a collection. And it was some years later when I went to visit the part of New Mexico that she lived some of her life in. They were an itinerant family, starting out in Texas, moving to New Mexico, eventually Arizona. And I went to find the graves of my great-grandparents. And it was a part of the desert that was quite desolate, and it was now a ghost town. There were just a few boards. I could barely make out what might have been the cemetery. And I stood there in the shifting sands and the wind, and it just it was this very sad moment because I knew that my great-grandmother had died there and been buried there when she was only about 36 years old. And I just realized there was a story to be told. I wanted to know how these things come about. And more than even the family story as much, it was a story of a people and a place and how things shift and the boom and bust and what it meant for real people and their families. So these personal notes about my grandmother's girlhood then became a bigger mission for me to tell the story of a people and time. And so it was at that point that I began compiling the stories. And many years later, and particularly it was actually during COVID, that I had that chance to go in and edit that manuscript that I had and just said, I'm going to send it out to the world.
Well, I can just tell from listening to you talk, you're so lyrical about this sense of place. So I know that place must hold a great deal of importance in your book.
Yes, we're deeply formed by the place that we live, particularly the geography where we are raised and where we, form ourselves, our personality, and of course, deeply affected by family in both positive and negative ways. And so I went to every locale of this itinerant youth she had, and just to get a sense of, what it felt like, and the smells and tastes and the culture of the place. Although certainly it's 100 years ago, it's certainly changed. But I think that really helped inform me, not having grown up where my grandmother grew up.
Well, it was so forward thinking of you to take notes and to write down this history and these stories from your grandmother. That's certainly one of my great regrets, is that I didn't record my grandparents and my parents' stories. I would love to hear their voices now, and to hear about those stories. We just didn't ask them enough when we were younger.
Well, that brings me to the point that when I began compiling this, and I thought about doing it as more of a biography for my family, I realized that I hadn't asked all the right questions. That when you try to put together a narrative, there are gaps and inconsistencies. And I also found, after interviewing aunts and uncles and cousins and second cousins, that there were several versions of a story. And I had to make a decision. And what I did at that point was realized, in order for me to get her voice, I wanted to tell it as first person. And in doing that and trying to fill in the gaps and using my imagination, I crossed the line to historical fiction. And in a sense, that was a blessing. I think it gave me the freedom to really imagine a scene and a conversation, and to bring other characters, her family members in particular, develop their personalities, because I didn't know them. I had met a few of them in their old age. And so I only had to imagine what they were like as young people. And so in that way, I was able to make a better narrative, a more cohesive one, and imagine what happened in different transition times.
I think some people are calling that creative nonfiction now, when there's a character that had a real life, and then you can weave the fiction around her or him.
Well, in a sense, all memoir is creative nonfiction, because even in a day, our memories can shift. And you can ask 2 or 3 people who witnessed an event what they saw, and you'll have slightly different memories. But I would say this is definitely fiction. And the reason why is because, for example, I knew that there was a very important older woman mentor in her life, and she talked about her. I knew her name, but I did not know her personality at all. So in a sense, I changed the name because it would not be true. And in that case, she is a fictional character, completely fictional. There was another fictional character I brought in to represent many of the neighbors that they dealt with and got to know well in that part of New Mexico, in the desert. They had to rely on each other a lot. There was very little support for them, few resources that they had. And so I invented this one character in order to represent the qualities of many of their neighbors.
Well, you've been published many times, but when you completed the manuscript for this historical fiction book, how did you proceed? Did you search for an agent, or decide to use a hybrid, a small press, or did you self-publish?
So I made the decision to publish this manuscript, which I had written years before. And as you said, I was a teacher. I was very busy raising my family. I had put it away. I had looked for a agent, was unsuccessful originally, put it away. And then it was during COVID. Many of us were wondering how we were going to get through this, and thinking about when this is over, what we might want to do. And one of the top things on my list was to publish this book. It meant so much for me personally. So I went directly to She Writes Press. I chose it because it's a Western press based in Berkeley and in Arizona. And I felt that it was a women's press founded by women, run primarily by women. And this was a woman's story. And I felt for this book, it was a perfect fit. And it's been a great experience, almost exactly 2 years from the time I submitted it. It came out in book form, and it was just such a delight to see this book. The one thing I tried to do also is in some way channel my grandmother. So what I realized when bringing story, family lore into fiction, what I realized over time was what I wanted most was her spirit and her personality to be true, and for to be true to the sense of the time. And as I went along, I realized every fact wasn't necessary. Those things are just more, they're important in telling the story for your reader to feel like they're there. But whether or not it was a bowl of cornmeal or a bowl, it didn't matter. But I did try to stay true to her. And having known her, she was a spunky, very loving, compassionate, but spirited woman. And I wanted that to come through.
Well, I think you chose well with She Writes Press as a hybrid press, and it's very well respected in the industry. I've interviewed many of their authors, and they're always such interesting people, and they have to choose your book. It's not a vanity press. It's a highly recognized process. And I think the best thing that I hear from the writers who choose to publish with them is that they create such a wonderful community of women who stay in touch long after their books are finished.
Yes, I've made some great friendships. The other thing about that press is it went through many rounds of very severe editing in my case. And again, anytime you take family stories and put them together, there's more than you can possibly fit in. This is a good sized story and a saga. Nonetheless, I had to cut 15,000 words. We also went through several rounds of editing and sensitivity reader as well. So I was able to bring this photo that I thought would be perfect for the cover. And they have an excellent design team. And I was really pleased with it.
Well, was cutting 15,000 words, was the editing part of your artistic process the most challenging, or was there something else that was more challenging?
I believe it was that. I'm trying to decide what part of the story was least essential. And in some ways, it's positive. Having written many essays and a lot of nonfiction, that goes through a lot of editing too, particularly when it's research based. And this too, I did so much research about the time and the culture at the technology, every the settings. And so you might do 10 pages worth of research notes and use maybe a paragraph or a few lines from it. That is always challenging, to know what serves the story or what is the author just fallen in love with. So some of that was cutting out extra research details. And being a historian, I was always interested in showing where the characters were in their times, in the history of the times, because she went through World War I, which is fascinating, a period of time. There was the influenza pandemic, which followed. And then there was a series of boom and bust events, partly catalyzed by the change from the silver standard to the gold standard for American currency, which meant many, many silver mines were closed down at this time. So yes, it was sometimes hard to kill your darlings, as they say, but I feel the story is better for it.
Well, did writing this book change your process of writing, or was it just different than what you were used to in writing poetry or the short stories? Because I hear a lot of people say that they wrote all of their lives and in their careers, but writing fiction is a whole different animal.
Particularly a novel. I'm much more comfortable with shorter forms, either essay or short stories. I enjoy writing that too. And so the novel has to have a different arc, a longer arc in a sense, maybe not different. And the other thing is when I went to begin this, not knowing where it was going, I overwrote, and you should, you know, stream of consciousness, you write every possible scene and nuance and detail that you love it to bring it. And often in the very first versions, the writer is writing for themselves anyway. They're trying to figure out, what am I trying to say? They're trying to make sense of things. And they do write longer. And then you go back and say, okay, now I found the narrative arc. Now I found where this conflict is going to happen. And you can go back and rewrite. And of course, you need to cut because you've written more than you could possibly need. I realized, every author has to ask, why do I write? And in this, particularly this story, I was writing to make sense of things. So there was definitely generational trauma in my family due to my great-grandfather's alcoholism and just them being in a place and time that was overwhelmingly difficult and challenging. And I partly wrote to understand my father, but in order to understand him, I had to understand his parents and his grandparents. And in this process of writing this, I began to understand myself better too. And if it comes right down to it, why does a writer write? To understand their world and themselves and where they fit in.
That's exactly right. And I do think it's therapy. I do think getting our words on paper will heal us in so many ways.
Family stories and what we can learn from them. Also, the historical times, as I wrote and researched them, they gave me perspective. You always find connections and tie-ins with every day. And sometimes you say, oh, this is not the first time. There's still boom and bust. And people need to be resilient and pick up and start anew. It's happening all the time. We are a very itinerant culture in a sense. I think always starting anew and looking for community and belonging and meaning. And so across these generations, these centuries, in some way, the human condition hasn't changed so much. And it's these commonalities that we find that I find fascinating. And I did want to bring some of this into the novel as well.
I'm always intrigued by character names and by titles. And you have a beautiful title, The Ways of Water. What does the title mean?
Interestingly enough, this is a picture of a desert on the cover. In the Great Painted Desert, if you can see, she's standing on a log, which was once a massive tree. And so in the long range, this was once a lush place, eons ago, I don't know how long. And the change that water can bring, it's probably one of the greatest forces, life-giving forces on the earth. And yes, the theme of water comes in and out of the novel many times, from the dearth of water in the desert. Josie Bell, the protagonist's father, was a steam locomotive engineer. And one reason they were growing up in these desolate tank towns is because the steam locomotives used to have to stop every 8 to 10 miles to retank with water. And these places, once in the 20s, when the water tanks were on the trains, these places all died out. They didn't need to stop so often. But yes, the insatiable thirst of the steam locomotives, which really forced the changes in their lives. The role of water, one part of it, they're damming the Rio Grande, and that was the first dam there. And the changes that damming a river can bring, positive for agriculture, but also the negative effects of trying to remodel an environment, but also water as a healer. The metaphor of drowning and then saving oneself. And then she ends up on the Pacific, where water was everywhere, and particularly for a young girl who's formed by a dry desert environment, this represented tremendous change and kind of a new life for her.
Well, I've never been so interested in water as I am now living in Texas.
It comes to have a greater importance, doesn't it, when there's...
It definitely is. I came from Mississippi where it rained constantly and I didn't like the rain. And now I long for it out here in the desert. And we have to have wells and be so conscious of when it rains and if it will rain. And that's the first thing everybody talks about is the weather.
Yeah, well, even rainy up here in the rainy Northwest, we still talk about the rain all the time, because the whole ecosystem is so dependent on large amounts. If it doesn't come, it's also dramatic. The cedars start dying. So we're all dependent, no matter what our norm is. Yeah.
Well, we writers love to write. We don't always like to promote ourselves. And I've been told that even the writers who have gone with big five publishing houses have to promote themselves and do their own legwork. Have you found any challenges with promoting yourself, with publicity, anything that's worked for you, or maybe something you've tried that didn't work?
Well, experiences like this, Julia, talking to readers has been the most fulfilling part of it. I've had numerous book talks in small bookstores, intimate talks, some larger talks too. And the questions that come from the readers are fascinating. In fact, they help me to get deeper into the story as well, and even think of things in different ways. But I always like to make connections with my readers because this is a family story. It's a story of family lore. Everyone has family stories. And I really try to encourage everyone to at least get them recorded. Because if you know them and you don't, they will be lost. And so often when we learn history, it's the big events, the wars and stuff. But more importantly are the small stories. And that's where we can find connection with the past and learn from it and be inspired by it. And so I really encourage my readers at these events to interview the elders before they're gone and write them down. And even if no one in your family is interested, they will be someday. Someone will be so grateful for this. And I think my grandmother's story really brought me courage. Again, these were difficult times, beginning of the 20th century. One other thing was they were experiencing rapid technological change, and it was dizzying and confusing for them. And they were seeing their lifestyles change. There was the automobile that came in, the telephone. And I make the parallel that we have also, particularly those over 50, have experienced rapid change from our childhoods. And it's not so different. We need to negotiate those with as much grace as we can and try not to lose the good and, embrace the good, embrace the improvements in our lives like this, this opportunity to talk like this.
That's been one of my missions, is to try to get people to keep journals, at least for their family members. They don't have to publish, but my grandfather went from the horse and buggy to seeing men on the moon. And there are just so many stories in there, and we just should have written them all down. We should have recorded them. And I regret that we did not. So I think it's just great for families to have these legacies to pass along as you're doing.
Yeah, it's really been wonderful talking with readers, and some of them leave saying, okay, I'm going to write these stories. One of my favorite courses in college was a course on the history of the West. I had a great professor. And when I finished that course, I realized I have this history in my family. These aren't strangers. And that was really in my 20s when I started interviewing my grandmother more often and making sure to record what she had to say.
Well, why don't you tell us a little bit about the passage you've brought to share today and then read so we can hear your tone and voice in the book?
Thank you. It was nice to hear you say there in Texas, you're so dependent on wells, because there they were too. And I chose a reading from the beginning of the book, where Josie is a very young girl. And it begins with, again, another water theme, Josie's experience with the family well there in the desert. And this is in the Jornada del Muerto, which is that part of New Mexico desert north of Las Cruces, south of Socorro. When Papa came home, he stalked out to the well, drew up a bucketful, smelled it, and leaned over for a look. There's something foul in the water. He let the bucket down again. I can't get to it. I've a mind to send somebody down. He scanned the clump of family until his eyes settled on me. Josie Belle, you're the one. I hid behind Mama's skirt. I can do it, Charlie said. You're too little. Josie's just right. I poked my head out and glared at Charlie. This was his fault. We'd been sick as dogs for a week. A critter had gotten into the well, or been thrown in. When I'd accused my brother, he'd shook his head, spit on his palm, and swore he hadn't done it. Sakes alive, Harry. Josie's only 6, Mama said. Can't you send down one of the section crew? Too big and too heavy. Papa took my arm and led me to the well. I'm going to tie you to a bucket. The rope's plenty strong. I'll let you down nice and easy. When you hit the water, shout and I'll hold you there. Grab onto whatever varmint's floating and I'll bring you up. I stared down into the shaft. I wasn't sure Papa was strong enough to pull me back up. What if the rope broke? I couldn't swim. I shook my head and looked down at my toes. I don't want to. Papa bent down, lifted my chin, and looked me in the eyes. Child, nothing on this earth comes easy. You just got to do what needs doing. Mama leaned over the opening and peered down the well. How deep is it? Don't know, 30 or 40 feet. Shouldn't we get help? Nope, I can handle this. I wished he'd called for Shorty, the railroad crew leader, who was as strong as a steer. Mama sighed. Water was everything to us. Take off your shoes and your dress. Your undershirt and drawers are all you need. You don't want to get tangled up. She pulled me to her belly, nuzzled her face in my hair, and turned me away. Now be sure to hold on tight and call out if something's not right. Then I was straddling the wooden bucket, had a rope securely tied around my waist, and Papa was letting me down into the dark.
Wow, that's a wonderful passage. So vivid and so descriptive.
And this was a true event. I had to imagine the details of it, but it was a story that my grandmother repeated again and again to multiple members of her family. I'm sure this is something that had happened to you. You never forget.
No, I can just imagine that scared little girl. Did you have to complete a lot of research before you began writing? And this was your family story, but did you have to do research as you went along or before you began?
I did it as I wrote. I would come, so the story is divided up by geography because they're itinerant. And then she was separated by her family at about the age of 14 and traveled on her own, a real odyssey of not only, trying to survive, but, finding herself, becoming an independent person. So I divided it by geography places. And so as I got to each section, yes, I would then do as much research as I could about that place at that time. I knew the years. And that informed much of my writing about what her experiences would have been in that place at that time. Yes, I love the research, of course. I was a history teacher as well. And one thing I tried to do when I taught my high school students was to bring history alive for them. And I tried to do the same in my writing to really place my reader in that place at that time. And sometimes you do it through detail, but also, what were those events that she would have been in the news, that everyone would have been talking about, that might have affected her. For example, after World War I, many of the soldiers came back, and many of the women that were employed during World War I were fired. They're sent home because the men needed the jobs, assuming they would be supporting families. So she was let go from her job as a telegraph operator at the end of the war. So knowing that in that place where she was, of course, that would have happened to her, and it did.
Teresa, do you have any other books in you?
I am working on a collection of short stories that are place-based. And also I'm working on a memoir about one rather exceptional year of my life. So yes, I have lots of projects, and I still love writing creative nonfiction essays, and it keeps me in the practice of writing all the time. And so I enjoy that. That's just a passion of mine.
What does writing success look like to you personally?
For this book, it was just a goal of mine, and so fulfilling spiritually. So this maybe was different. It was much more personal. I think success for me is growing as a writer. I love to challenge myself and try different forms and genres. It's such a creative process, and I find I'm more creative when I challenge myself. So yes, to continue to publish, and success is meeting and talking to my readers and being stimulated and inspired by them as well.
That's so true. And we have had a wonderful visit here today. And I would like to ask you our final interview question, which is, our writers over 50 are quite unique. Do you have advice for writers 50 and above?
I would just say, don't give up. Our lives have been fortunately long and full, and you have so much wisdom inside you, so much to share at this time in your life. And also just don't give up on that passion. You have a lot to offer the world, and your age is working for you. Your perspective and your ability to organize things, in a longer stream. So again, just you have strong voice, and get it out there.
That's great advice. I think those of us who have lived this long have the wonderful vision of hindsight, and we have so much history, which you love so much, and you can feel that and see that in your writing. You're such a beautiful writer. You're lyrical, and you can hear that poetic voice coming out in your beautiful descriptions, and everything is so vivid in your work. So we just appreciate your being here with us today. And we're excited to now count you among our authors over 50.
Thank you, Julia. It's been a delight. And to all the listeners, thank you for being here.
Thank you for joining us today. Please look for Authors Over 50 every Thursday, when we will have conversations with accomplished debut novelists over the age of 50. Please subscribe and share with a friend. And check out my own publication journey after 50 at www.janssen.com. www.juliadaily, that's DAILY, like dailynewspaper.com. Until next time, keep reading and writing. And remember, it's never too late to fulfill a dream in life's sweetest third.